Well, everybody, thanks for coming today. We're back in Boston at Faneuil Hall at yet another tea party, okay? And with me today I have Edwin Vieira, who I've learned some about, but I want to learn more about. When I'd start with, what brings you here in Boston to a tea party at Faneuil Hall?
Well, I hope it's the same thing that brought the original tea party celebrants, if you will, to Griffin's Wharf. We have some problems in this country that need to be dealt with through self-government. We're going to be talking today, I am at least, primarily about the Federal Reserve and the problem of the monetary and banking system and some approaches to correcting that. And I'm sure that other speakers will be talking about other aspects of the total difficulties this country is in. But my theme is ultimately self-government. I mean, if we don't govern ourselves, someone else is going to govern us, and they're doing a pretty bad job of it right now.
I'm actually in a lot of agreement with you. The other thing, when you said you'll be speaking about the Fed, one of my favorite topics for my viewers, I always try to enlighten them a little that, well, just in the recent weeks, how we've been at this point where we create money from nothing at a greater rate than ever before in history, it seems. With this new bailout, I want to say rescue plan or rip-off thing, whatever they want to call it, but now, from what I understand from Bloomberg and from Reuters or whatever, they're up to $8.5 trillion of bailout, funding that was money that didn't exist prior.
That's right, and that's just the beginning because we have no idea precisely how deep this black hole may be. But what they have demonstrated is their willingness to open up the spigots of what they call liquidity, new money, new credit, ultimately without limit, depending on what they fear is the danger to the total system. See, they have to maintain the institutional structure. And the only way they can maintain the institutional structure is by constantly pumping new money and credit into it, because the other alternative is contraction and collapse.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah, but on the other side, the excessive, and almost any increase in the money supply is theoretically excessive from the point of view of the market, but the excessive amount of liquidity they're pumping in could lead in the direction of hyperinflation. So they're kind of walking with one foot on each side of the yellow line and not sure exactly where they want to put their weight.
Edwin, can you tell us a little bit about, recently the Federal Reserve just announced that they wanted to issue their own bills. Like right now, part of the way money's created anyway, is that the United States government borrows, okay, and they give to that private bank these, treasury bills and treasury notes, right. And then the bank issues money based on that.
Right, they monetize debt.
They monetize debt. I heard something to the effect that they just announced, this is the Federal Reserve, that they were going to monetize their own debt. In other words, issue their own bills, like a bond or whatever.
Well, exactly. And that's probably to get around the problem that for the Treasury to issue more and more debt, they need a congressional authorization. So we have debt ceilings built in. Of course, you've heard that term, debt ceiling.
Yeah,
there are limits, statutory limits. Now, of course, Congress can change them, but someone has to go to Congress and make that change.
It's funny, we just recently had the president-elect. We had the presidential elections. And we had the new gentleman, Obama, or whatever's coming in power. When I say in power, it's even bad that I'm using the word power, right. But he's coming into office. And then I found out that his Treasury Secretary appointee, the person he'd like to have, is the head of the New York Fed right now. Mm-hmm. So for my viewers and stuff, do you expect we're going to have much change in our I don't want to say economic policy, but at least monetary policy with, the head of the Fed now running the Treasury or trying to?
Well, let me put it this way. We will not have change we can believe in. All right?
Okay.
You're going to have essentially the same policy because they're riding a tiger. This system really gives them very little degree of freedom, now especially, because with the contraction, first it was in the mortgage market, then in the derivatives and so forth, they built up this huge bubble.
Right.
As this bubble starts to contract, what underlays the currency? It's debt. For every dollar of debt that disappears, turns out to be bad, turns out to be unpayable,
yep.
Some multiple, it might be 10 times as much currency has to disappear. Right? Because they're using a fractional reserve system.
And it was based on that debt
being real. And it was based on that debt being, real in the sense of having real value at some point down the line. When it proves not to have that value, they have to contract the currency. Now you run into depressionary phenomenon. And they can't afford to have a depressionary phenomenon politically because that's the most destabilizing of all circumstances. People are out of jobs, they're thrown out of their homes, they can't get food. In the middle of winter.
Yeah. Is this a good way for people to consolidate wealth? If they were able, if someone was able to orchestrate this, upon the society, could they utilize it as a vehicle? Because right now I see them giving banks money. I mean, that was the whole idea. And let me back up one. In regards to the quote bailout rescue plan that I was calling ripoff for my viewers, can you tell us constitutionally, How does the Treasury Secretary, how does Congress give up the powers that were granted to them via the Constitution to now the Treasury Secretary?
Well, they can't, really. They can't delegate what would amount to legislative authority to an executive officer. They can delegate to an executive officer the power to implement or execute a law that has specific standards built into it. So Congress would have to specify how much money, where is it going, what kind of standards have to be applied, what kind of facts have to be found, so that somebody later on can review that and determine whether or not the Secretary has followed the will of Congress. Simply giving the blank check and saying, well, you do what you think is right, it's clearly a violation of the Constitution. But on the other hand, Congress is really not in a position, because of the mess they've created, to sit down and debate every one of these potential elements of the bill. Look what they've done with the auto industry, as a for instance. And then what did Bush come along with, President Bush come along with and say, well, I don't care what the Senate said. We're still going to go ahead with this.
Let me ask you another one, constitutionally based, and that is, when they first did the bailout plan, notice they did it on the weekend, and then that failed. When I say failed, Congress turned it down, and thumbs up for Congress for having a little bit of, chutzpah or whatever. And then the Senate then created or rewrote it and then pushed it back to the Congress. Am I wrong in understanding that the Constitution says all the legislative powers are held in the House?
All spending bills must originate in the House, because the House, of course, is that branch of Congress is closest to the people. Right? Because originally, the senators were elected by the state legislatures.
Right.
Okay. So they wanted spending. Taxation without representation was one of the problems that led the war to pass. They wanted spending determined by the representatives closest to the people. What happened in this particular case was the Senate took a bill dealing with something else entirely. They deleted all of the substance of that bill. All they used was the number, and they made it into a spending bill. And they claimed, well, because that bill that they had originally used came out of the House, that therefore they weren't limited by the constitutional requirement. And of course, that's simply an obvious subterfuge.
It's like bait and switch.
Absolutely.